Let's open our Bibles to Titus 2. We've been looking through Titus 2. We're going to continue to go through Titus 2. And as we go there, especially with the ending of this chapter in our minds, I want you to think about the motivation and empowerment to live the life that we've been looking at. The Titus 2 women could be defined as women energized by grace. You see, it's impossible to live the way that the early church was called by Christ through the apostles to live. To go from where they were to where he called them to be was physically, humanly impossible. That's why they were told that the grace of God that brought them salvation is the grace of God that would energize them to live that way. You see, we each were saved by God's grace. That was impossible. It's not humanly accomplishable. We are kept by God's grace. We cannot hold on tight enough, do enough to keep ourselves to the end. It is God who keeps us secure and safe to the end. And we live in a way every day that pleases God and earns his rewards. But that is only when we are energized by his grace, as verses 11, 12, 13, and on talk about in this chapter. These past few weeks, we've been looking at God's high calling for women. And in his church, the thought of living in that way was overwhelming in the first century. They were pagans, they were steeped in paganism, they thought like pagans, they looked like pagans, and they came into Christ's church, and they were told that they were to act like holy and reverent servants of God. That was impossible. And so Paul began to teach them that though it may seem that living that way is impossible, it is the truth. It is impossible. But Titus 2 women live a humanly impossible life. They must be energized by God's grace to live that way. So for just a minute, I want you to step back and look at the bigger picture. Look at where the Titus 2 woman fits within the context of all that God is doing in this world through salvation. The New Testament church that Jesus Christ left his plan for, that we as believers this morning are a part of, is defined as the life of new beginnings. It's the life that not only are we a new creation in Christ, but we get that opportunity to have a fresh new start every day in Christ. That's just the foundation of this life that we have. We are energized each step of the way by the grace of God. And Titus 2, before us this morning, is a roadmap for all who want their life to count. If you have the new beginning, if you have the Spirit of God living within, if you have the grace of God teaching us how to live, then you want to, and I want to, follow the roadmap for all who want their life to count. It's God's pathway of the disciplines that we consciously choose every day to follow, energized by the Spirit of God, prompted and motivated by God's grace. But it's a choice we make. You see, the Titus 2 person, man or woman, young man or young woman, does not become that way by just saying it's going to happen. Kind of the pacifistic movement in Christianity where they thought that they would let go and God would just do whatever he wanted to do. It doesn't work that way. The New Testament talks about it being warfare, that we consciously take up armor. As the Apostle Paul said, we are like athletes that must discipline our bodies. We must stay within our lane or we get disqualified. It's impossible to do that without God's grace, but it will not happen without our choice to comply and to obey. So that's what Paul was telling them. God's plan to work in the world is in his church. And Christ's church may be described as a group of people energized by grace, doing the impossible for the glory of God. That's who we are, common, ordinary people, doing impossible things. Energized through the power of God resident in us by his Spirit because of his grace. And all of it occurring for his glory, not ours. That's what his church is all about. A key insight into God's plan to reach this world through Christ's church is in this chapter before us, Titus 2. The verses of this chapter contain a call to a first century church, a group of men and women. Always remember the context of the Bible is this was not written to me, nor to you. It was written to someone else. But God's Spirit applies that also to me. You see, this was actually a literal letter to a literal group of people that were alive on planet Earth about 2,000 years ago on a little island out in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. Because it was inspired by God's Spirit, it went beyond them to us. But the first law of interpretation is you must understand, what did God mean to them? What did God call them to do? Because if we see that, it's what He also calls us to do. So let's look at what He called them to do. He called them to live an extraordinary spiritual life in the midst of a very unspiritual culture. A couple years ago, in April, I was invited by some group to come and lecture a group of 90 pastors on the island of Crete. They paid my way and they flew me over there with Bonnie, and I lectured 90 pastors, taking them all around the island of Crete. Well, I'd never been to Crete before. Of course, I had the material that God wrote to Crete. And the first lecture, I'll never forget, I was standing in the midst of this Minoan civilization castle where the Minotaur and the labyrinth and all that stuff comes from, and I was standing there. And I stood up on my little deal I stood up on, and all these 90 pastors were gathered around, and they had their recorders, and they had their notebooks, and they were looking at their cameras, and they were looking at me. And the first thing I said is, when Paul wrote to a pastor named Titus, who was serving on this island, and immediately out there, 90 clucks started going on. And they were all whispering to each other, and finally one of them raised their hand, and they said, "How did you know that Paul wrote to Titus? How do you know that?" I said this. None of them actually brought one of these on the trip. This was a group of, and I won't say the denomination, I didn't know this when I volunteered to do it, but they don't really use this. And from that point onward, for the next 10 days, they hounded me at every meal. They said, "You mean Paul wrote the book of Philippians to the church in Philippi that we're going to go to?" I said, They said, "How do you know that?" I said, "Because it says it." But they said, "Why do you believe that?" Because I said, "I believe that God inspired the Bible." And it was the most revolutionary thought to them. They never stopped. On the bus, they just asked me a million questions because they never in their denomination ever thought that the Bible meant what it says. It means something else. You've got to work all week long and read the newspaper and read poetry and find something to say because the Bible couldn't possibly mean what it says. That's the condition of America's church today. That's why they don't use the Bible a lot, because they don't even know what it's for. They don't know what it means. They don't know what it was written for, who it was written to, who it was written by. And so it was a great tour. And I told them standing there that day, I said, this was a very unspiritual culture. In fact, behind me was the alleyway that led to where the human sacrifices were done. And I said, the Apostle Paul wrote to a young pastor named Titus who was living on this island, who were the ancestors, as I said last week, of the Philistines, David and Goliath, the horrible Philistine, anti-God, warring against God's people culture. Those were people who sailed from the island of Crete. And I said, and it was no different in the time of Paul, 1,000 years later. And I said, it was a very unspiritual culture. And God called them to live an extraordinary spiritual life in that very unspiritual culture. And when grace energizes us, we want to deny ungodliness in any form we find it cropping up in our lives. And it will crop up in our lives. We were not eradicated. You know what eradication is? That's the incorrect belief of some denominations of Christendom. And they believe that when they got saved, their old nature was cut out of them, that they are no longer having the flesh, and they are just a new creation in Christ, and there's no old nature. They were eradicated. It was stomped out. They squirted Roundup on it, and it withered up and died, and it never comes back. And some of the greatest proponents of that, when I was young, used to speak at Bible conferences. And I remember I would watch them sitting over in the corner, and they'd come up, and just before they would speak, they would pull out of their pocket their little mirror, and they would get all prepared to come up in the pulpit, and they'd put away men carrying mirrors, And I remember one time one of the other pastors asked one of those combing his hair pastors, he says, "Do you still have any pride?" And he says, "No, I'm eradicated." And I thought how incredible it is to think of eradication, because it is impossible for us to deny the fact that we are constantly besieged with desires that are not from God. And so Paul tells them, grace will energize you to deny those ungodly desires, no matter where they crop up in your life. And when grace energizes us, we want to mortify. You know what mortify means? Kill. We don't permanently kill the flesh that still is operative in us, but any manifestation that we are aware of through the grace of God, by the power of the Spirit of God, through the weapons He gives us, and through disciplining, and as Paul puts it, mortifying our desires. And that's what was going on in these people's lives. They were mortifying lust in any form. And when we study this idea of the older in the faith, godly Titus 2 woman, we are describing a woman who has chosen to learn from God how to live her life day by day and step by step in a way that pleases God. She's not perfect. She still has her flesh. She still struggles every day with some way that the flesh crops up in her life. But she is highly useful to God because she has learned how to consciously, willfully choose, energized by God's grace, to say no to sin and yes to God.